Hi, Life Groups. So glad that you are meeting this evening or wherever you're at to come together, connect with each other, connect with Scripture, connect in prayer. Really grateful for you, Life Group leaders, who are leading your group right now. Well done, well done. We are in week 2 of our journey through Philippians. The series is called Rejoice. All of us want to be happy. In fact, studies show that the desire for happiness is second only to the desire for health and long life. Everybody, we just want to be happy. What we see in Philippians and what we're going to see in this week is that happiness is different than joy. And usually with happiness, we think about circumstances. And so you're out at the lake or everything in your life is going well. Whereas we're confronted with this idea of joy. Paul continually in the in the letter of Philippians talks about rejoicing, and he is in prison. And so we're confronted, properly and rightfully confronted, about the difference between happiness and joy. So what we looked at this weekend was 3 big ideas. We're going to see that Paul is joyful in jail, he's joyful in life and death, and then he appeals to the Philippians at the end. So the first one is he talks about his present circumstance. He's got joy in chains. In verse 12, Paul says, "Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel." Sets the tone for the entire thing, that although he is in jail in the first century in Rome, which is not the type of jail that we have today, there's no outside time, there's no high definition TVs. Paul is in jail in Rome, and yet he sees his circumstances being informed by the gospel, that what has happened to me, there's a higher purpose. It's actually the gospel is going out. So in verse 13 and 14, he talks about where it's gone out. The first one, it's inside the prison. He says, as a result, it's become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. He gets probably 4-hour shifts of guards coming in watching Paul, and these guards are being affected by Paul's ministry, Paul's perspective, and the gospel. And it's interesting that he equates his present circumstance for Christ. He says, I am in chains for Christ. In other words, he sees his present circumstance as a part of his discipleship. That this is what it means to follow Jesus, that a part of this is some suffering, some hardship. And that's really important for us too, that sometimes when we go through things, it isn't apart from God's will, it's actually a part of following Jesus. So he says this is what's happening inside the prison. And then in verse 15 to 17, he says outside the prison too, that the gospel is advancing. And he talks about outside of these prison walls in Rome, because of the vacuum left by Paul's absence, leaders have risen up and are doing ministry. Some are doing ministry with great motives. They want to preach the gospel. Others have come into leadership with an ulterior motive. He says this, the former preach Christ, in verse 17, out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. And so Paul's a massive leadership figure in the first century. He is now taken out of leadership, and in the vacuum, other leaders rise up and want to correct Paul with the ministry that they're doing, and they're doing so with bad motives. This could have made Paul upset, angry, frustrated, worried. Instead, in verse 18, he says, but what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, listen to what he says, I rejoice. Paul's main perspective in his life, the end of all things, is that if Christ is made known, everything is good, regardless of his personal circumstances, which is crazy. Either way is a win for Paul. Christ is preached. How does Paul have this perspective? In the midst of suffering, in the midst of hardship, he can rejoice. Why? Because Christ is preached. The reason that Paul can see this and say this is because of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Listen, when we have the cross and resurrection as the forefront on our screen, the forefront of our life, nothing doesn't fit, even death and suffering. Everything has a place and a purpose when the cross is central to your thinking and to your theology. See, some of us get a hangnail and we wonder, where's God in the midst of my hangnail? Paul's in prison and he says, Christ is being made known, and that is all that matters. So there's hope here. There's hope here in the midst of some of your suffering, in the midst of some of your hardship, that if we adopt the same perspective that Paul has, you can see your current circumstance in light of a bigger, grander story. That your story, the chapter of this story, may be difficult for you, but God can use this chapter in the grand story of redemptive history for a larger and better and greater purpose. See, happiness to Christians is fleeting, it's temporal. Paul gives us here a sense of rejoicing even in the midst of struggle and difficulty. The second idea is the future. From here, Paul says, and yes, I will continue to rejoice. He's overflowing. He says, for I know that through the prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. So he says, I hope I get out of prison. I think this is going to happen. But in the future, this is the idea that there's joy even in life and death. We come to probably one of the most well-known verses of the Apostle Paul in verse 21, because he says this, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. To live is Christ, and to die is gain. He says, regardless of what happens in the future, if I live, it's all about Jesus. If I die, it's probably better because I see him more fully. You got to think back for Paul to say, for me to live as Christ, you have to think to his story. Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, before he was called Paul by the Gentile unbelieving world, was a persecutor of Christians. He even himself in one of his letters calls himself a persecutor, a blasphemer, an injurer, an unbeliever, a chief of sinners, until in Acts chapter 9, where Paul dramatically gets converted to Jesus and everything in his life switches. His entirety of his life is towards Jesus. In Galatians, he says, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. You see, for Paul, Christ is the conscious center of his entire life. He's not an add-on. He's not an addition. He is the center in which all of the events of his life revolve around. So for us, how would you fill in that blank? For me to live is blank. Is it Christ? Or is it for me to live is to golf? For me to live is to be fit. For me to live is to seek pleasure. For me to live is to make money. For me to live is to be wounded. That this has become our identity. For me to live is to look good. You see, when we fill in that blank with anything but Jesus, our life is full of fear and it's built on shaky ground. You see, for us to seek the things apart from Jesus, to identify ourselves by our money, our pleasure, our golfing, our pleasure, whatever that is, or to look good, it's fleeting and it won't last. See, for us, for Paul, what it means to be a Christian is now he gets to live for Jesus in all of life's circumstances, whether he's in jail, whether he's shipwrecked, whether he's being persecuted. It's all about Jesus. And he actually says to the Philippians, for me to live is better for you. And if that's the case, that's what I want, is that my ministry would be yours. And then he says to die is gain. To die is gain. This is not to escape the hardship in his life, but rather to see Jesus fully. In Revelation 21:4, we're reminded that when we see Jesus as he is at the end of our life, at the end of all things, there will be no mourning, no groaning, no pain. And Paul in verse 23 says, I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. And so for us as followers of Jesus, there is this general feeling of life in this world that it's not all it should be. There's a groaning. There's this sense of, at some point, all of my questions will be answered, all of the tears will be wiped away, and that is what we long for. So how would you fill in the blank of to die is what? Is it scary? Is it the end? Is it final? See, for Paul, to live To live is Christ, but to die is gain. Do you have that longing for the end to see Jesus as he actually is? Or are you more comfortable and glad for the things of this world? See, when our goal, passion, and treasure is Christ, nothing can remove your joy. And then finally, in verse 27, he appeals now to this congregation. He has reflected on his own journey. In verse 27, he actually sets up the next bulk of the letter, and he appeals to them. And he says, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Jesus. And he fleshes out, what does this worthy life look like? 3 things. The first one, what does this worthy life look like is, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit. What he's encouraging this congregation to do is to stand firm in one spirit. That in the midst of the opposition that they're facing, we'll get into that later on in the letter, in the midst of the opposition, they need to stand firm together. This eclectic group of Jesus followers with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different family of origins, because of the Spirit of Jesus, stands firm together. What a witness in a polarized, tribal world. To live worthy of the gospel means that you and I, in your group, who think different, look different, act different, come from different backgrounds, are now one, firmly united in Jesus. We stand firm in one spirit. That's what it means to live a worthy life. The second thing is he says, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel. We stand firm, we also strive. This idea is actually an athletic metaphor in which we shoulder to shoulder contend together on a team. We work for the benefit of our city, for those in our world, in our life, in our sphere of influence who do not know the gospel. So we do this together, we stand firm, and we strive. We work together for the sake of Kamloops and beyond. So we contend, we serve together, we love together, we work together. We do Love Kamloops Banquet together. We go serve kids in Mexico together. You together in your life group, contend for the city, work on behalf of Jesus in partnership with him to do something. We contend. And so we come together on prayer nights to contend for our city, to contend for a work of God in our time. This is what we do. So to live a worthy life is you stand firm together, you strive together, shoulder to shoulder, working for Jesus. And then at the end, we also suffer for him. In verse 29, for it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him. This may mean physical suffering. It also may mean a bunch of different suffering. We're not at a place as they were in the first century to be persecuted for our faith. You and I probably won't die by the sword for our belief in Jesus, but we are called to suffer for him. Let me flesh that out. For some of us, that means we need to get more uncomfortable than we actually are. We need to actually share Jesus with our neighbor. We need to bring them, the unbelieving people in our world, to church. We need to put our reputation on the line. For some of us, we need to suffer for him by not cutting corners morally in our workplace. That we are called, you and I, to suffer for Jesus. As we contend together, we also suffer together. Hard hitting, isn't it? Paul does not dilute the message of the gospel, both in its hardship and for its implications for you and I as we follow Jesus in Kamloops in 2019. May God give you a rich sense of his presence and his blessing and the unity of your group as you work through this amazing book called Philippians. Bless you. Thanks.